She still remembers the sound first. The hum of the overhead fluorescent struggling to stay awake, flickering as if the building itself was too tired to keep going. It was just after 2 a.m., the hour when hospitals grow eerily quiet, when even the most chaotic emergency departments sink into a strange stillness. For Daniel Carter, a 34-year-old CT technician in Ohio, this was the time of night when the world felt suspended, like the hospital existed between breaths. He walked down the long corridor toward the CT suite with slow, measured steps, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee that had long since lost its battle against exhaustion. This was supposed to be a routine emergency scan, nothing he hadn't done 1,000 times before, but something in the air felt different. He couldn't explain it. He just felt it. At the far end of the hallway, he saw 2 nurses pushing a stretcher toward him, the wheels squeaking softly on the linoleum. Their patient, Mary Collins, lay motionless, wrapped in blankets that dwarfed her small frame. Mary was in her mid-50s, admitted just an hour earlier in what the attending physician described as rapid-onset septic shock. Her blood pressure wasn't stable, her breathing ragged, and her skin had taken on that cold, clammy sheen that experienced staff recognized immediately. But she was still conscious, barely, and stable enough for imaging. They needed to identify the infection source before it was too late. As the roller wheels passed Daniel, he felt a faint shift in temperature, as if he had walked through an invisible curtain of cold air. He brushed it off. Old hospitals had their quirks. Drafty vents, temperamental thermostats, motion sensors that sometimes flicker to life for no reason. He told himself it was nothing unusual, just another night. Inside the CT room, he began preparing the space with practiced efficiency. He checked the gantry alignment, powered up the monitors, and confirmed the emergency protocol settings. Everything looked normal, except the motion sensor near the ceiling blinked once, then again, as though detecting something moving in the room. Daniel frowned. He waved a hand beneath it. Nothing. The sensor stayed dark. Mary was transferred to the CT table, her eyes barely open, her breathing shallow but steady enough for the scan. He adjusted the straps around her arms, speaking softly, even though he wasn't sure she could hear him. There was a fragility about her, a gentleness, the kind of patient who apologized for being sick. He stepped into the control booth and began the sequence. The CT machine awakened with a low mechanical rumble, the circular gantry illuminating Mary with a pale clinical glow. On the monitor, the first scout image appeared, the rough outline of her body, framed in grayscale. And then, something else. For a single frame, so fast he wondered if he imagined it, an indistinct shape appeared beside Mary's upper torso. Not an anatomical structure, not an artifact, a presence. A dark mass without edges or form, as if someone had leaned close to her just as the image captured. Daniel blinked hard and leaned in toward the screen. The next frame was normal, perfectly normal. Glitch, he whispered to himself. Just a glitch. He replayed the scout. The shape flickered again, not long enough to analyze, but long enough to make his heart stutter. Dust, he told himself. A detector flare, a reflection, anything but what it looked like. He exhaled slowly and looked up from the monitors toward the CT room, expecting to see nothing out of place. Instead, his breath caught in his chest. In the far corner of the room, beyond Mary, beyond the reach of the overhead lights, stood a figure-shaped darkness, still, upright, human-sized, a shadow that had no source. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. His body locked, his fingertips numb against the control console. The room looked the same as always, but something inside it had shifted. Something was wrong. He blinked once more, convinced his vision was playing tricks on him. But the shadow didn't disappear. It was there, watching, waiting. For most of his career, Daniel had believed he understood hospitals better than almost anyone. He had spent more nights inside their walls than he had in his own apartment, learning early that the rhythm of medicine wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and sometimes inexplicably heavy. To outsiders, a CT technician's job seemed simple. Take images, follow protocols, stay precise. But to Daniel, it felt like standing at the intersection of life and the unknown. Every scan told a story. Some revealed answers. Others revealed tragedies. A few revealed things no one could explain. He hadn't planned on this career originally. Fresh out of high school, he worked odd jobs until a friend suggested radiological technology. The first time he stepped into an imaging suite, he felt something click. It was the combination of science and human vulnerability that pulled him in. During training, he witnessed more suffering than he expected. Car crash victims arriving with minutes to spare. Elderly patients fading quietly. Children with injuries too cruel for their age. The CT suite became a place of revelation, and Daniel learned to read images the way others read books. Shadows, densities, angles, anomalies. Every detail mattered. But the job was never just technical. He saw humanity in all its forms: fear, hope, resignation, and sometimes bravery. So quiet it felt sacred. Night shifts were where it all collided. The hospital transformed after midnight. Hallways dimmed, conversations lowered, staff numbers dropped, machinery hummed louder in the stillness. Chaos arrived in bursts, ambulance alarms, overhead codes. But between those moments, the silence grew thick enough to feel. Daniel often joked with colleagues about hospital ghosts, the stories nurses swapped during slow hours to keep themselves awake. A stretcher moving on its own, a figure seen at the end of a hallway. They laughed about it because laughter made the night feel less heavy. But Daniel never believed any of it literally. He trusted in science. He trusted in fatigue as an explanation for most unusual things. Long hours made the mind fabricate movement in shadows. Stress played tricks. He knew that. He understood that. Until the night with Mary Collins. Even before the shift began, he had been exhausted. 3 consecutive nights of understaffed chaos, trauma cases, stroke alerts, a pediatric emergency that still lingered in his mind. He hadn't slept more than a few broken hours. He knew exhaustion could distort perception, blur edges, make something ordinary appear strange. He repeated that to himself like a mantra as he replayed what he'd seen in the CT room. But the truth gnawed at him. Exhaustion might explain flickering lights or a cold draft. It didn't explain a human-shaped shadow standing perfectly still in a corner or nothing should be. As he walked back down the corridor after completing the initial scout images, he tried to steady his breathing. He reminded himself of protocols, of procedure, of logic. But beneath all that was a quiet rising dread, a sense that the night had shifted into something he wasn't trained to understand. And slowly, as the seconds ticked by, the question that he had forced away crept back into his mind. What exactly did I see in that room? Mary Collins arrived in the hospital just past midnight, brought in by paramedics who reported that she had collapsed at home after hours of worsening abdominal pain. Her medical chart documented the unfolding crisis with cold clinical precision: rapidly dropping blood pressure, dangerously high heart rate, and a fever spiking beyond 103. And lab results that pointed to sepsis, an infection overwhelming her entire body. To the emergency team, she was a race against time. To Daniel, she was another patient in need of answers, another human being relying on him to provide them. He remembered the brief moment before the scan when Mary opened her eyes, thin, tired, hazy. Her voice was barely audible. She apologized for being a bother, for keeping everyone awake at this hour, and Daniel felt something twist inside him. Patients on the brink of collapse often said things like that, as though their suffering was an inconvenience to others. But there was something especially fragile about the way Mary said it. As he lifted her arm to place the IV contrast line, her hand trembled slightly, either from fever or fear. Maybe both. The nurses who accompanied her stayed only long enough to help transfer her onto the CT table. Once she was positioned safely and the restraints were secured, they exited the room, expecting to return shortly. Critical scans like this usually lasted only minutes. Daniel watched them leave, their footsteps fading down the hall. Suddenly, the suite felt too quiet, too still. The lingering thought of the shadow he'd seen earlier clung to him like a cold breath at the back of his neck. He wasn't supposed to feel uneasy in this room. The CT suite was his territory, bright, sterile, predictable. But as he looked at Mary lying there, alone except for him, an unsettling truth crept in. If something was in that room, Mary wasn't alone. And neither was he. He shook the thought away and began the next stage of the scan. The gantry hummed, its circular ring rotating smoothly around Mary's body. One by one, the images appeared on his monitor, axial slices, thin and detailed, revealing the inner map of her abdomen. Daniel leaned closer, adjusting the window level, narrowing his focus. On slice 42, something caught his eye. A tiny distortion near her chest. A small, dense flicker of black. Too dark to be tissue, too defined to be noise. He frowned and moved to the next slice. The distortion was larger. On the next, larger still. By slice 45, he felt his breath catch. A long, shadow-like smear stretched from the top of Mary's shoulder to the edge of the frame. But it wasn't random, not the kind of static that imaging artifacts usually created. It had shape, intention. It looked as though it was reaching toward her. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he cycled through the images again. He checked the system settings, the detector calibration, the exposure levels. Everything was normal. There was no mechanical reason for a moving dark shape to appear from slice to slice. Yet it moved. Slowly. Deliberately. He swallowed hard. No, this isn't right, he whispered to himself. He toggled the brightness. The shadow persisted. He magnified the image. It sharpened. Each new frame showed the shape shifting position, always nearer to Mary, always leaning closer to her chest, closer to her face. A cold ripple spread through Daniel's body. He felt rooted in place, as if stepping away might provoke whatever he was seeing. But as the final slices processed, and the voice inside him whispered that this was not a glitch, not fatigue, not imagination, he knew what he needed to do. He had to go back into that room. Every instinct screamed for him to stay in the booth, but he pushed himself up, heart pounding, palms clammy. He opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking into the silence, and he stepped inside the CT room, unsure if he was about to confront a malfunction or something far more terrifying. Mary's chest rose sharply, once, as if someone had pulled the air from the room and forced it into her lungs. And then, her body went still. The code team flooded the room, unclipping restraints, initiating CPR, preparing medications. Chaos erupted around the CT table. Voices shouting, heels scraping, equipment beeping. Daniel stood back against the wall, helpless, breathless, trying to force his mind to accept the logical explanation he wanted so desperately to believe. Stress, exhaustion, a trick of the light, an image glitch, anything but what the scan had shown. But the truth was unavoidable. He hadn't imagined the shadow. He had seen it, and it had moved. When the code team fully took over the CT suite, Daniel backed into the doorway, gripping the metal frame so tightly his knuckles blanched. The tidal wave of organized chaos filled the room. Compressions, shouted vitals, medication doses thrown into the air like fast, clipped commands. It was the familiar choreography of resuscitation. Yet, something felt profoundly altered, as though the room itself resisted every attempt to save Mary. A nurse rolled in the crash cart, yanking open drawers. Another hurriedly placed electrodes across Mary's chest. The doctor leaned over her, calling out, Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. Footsteps thundered behind Daniel as respiratory therapy arrived with the ventilator. The CT room was never designed for this many people, and it felt smaller with every passing second. Still, the team worked with practiced precision. Compressions, bagging, pulse check. Nothing. "Come on, Mary," whispered the charge nurse, voice straining. "Stay with us." To Daniel, the words seemed to echo, bouncing eerily off the CT gantry. He couldn't shake the sensation that the room was colder now. Not a draft, not environmental, something deeper, like the warmth had been pulled out of the air entirely. He forced himself to look at Mary again. Her face had taken on a grayish tone, but her expression, peaceful, almost resigned, felt at odds with the violent effort happening around her. A strange sense of déjà vu crept up Daniel's spine. He'd seen death before, many times, but never with this strange foreknowledge. Like the outcome had already been decided the moment he saw that impossible silhouette in the scan. Another round of meds, more compressions, a second pulse check. "Still asystole," someone said softly. A stillness rippled through the team. They all knew what that meant, but they continued, because sometimes the 10th minute was the miracle minute. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to silence the memory of the screen, the shape bending over her as though claiming something. He blinked repeatedly, fighting the urge to run. It was irrational, unprofessional. He knew it, but every instinct yelled that something unseen was still here. And then, it happened again. Just as the respiratory therapist prepared for another bagging cycle, Mary's arm twitched. It lifted off the table. Not a spasm, not a reflex, a controlled movement. Her fingers curled toward her chest, then stopped midair. The entire room froze. Even the doctor paused, mouth slightly open. Did she just... A nurse stepped closer, eyes wide. That wasn't me. I wasn't touching her. The monitor still showed flatline. No electrical activity. No heartbeat. No reason she should move. Daniel's heart slammed into his ribs. He knew what he had seen, and the room knew it too, even if no one dared to say it. A cold, suffocating silence fell over the team, thick enough that several staff exchanged looks but kept working, unwilling to acknowledge anything outside clinical explanation. "Continue compressions," the doctor ordered. But Daniel couldn't tear his eyes from Mary's still hovering hand. Slowly, impossibly, it lowered back down, resting on the table as gently as if someone had guided it. He felt the weight of invisible eyes on him again, watching from somewhere in the corner of the room. Mary's vitals never recovered. The code was eventually called. Time of death was marked quietly. The moment the words were spoken, the CT suite seemed to exhale, lights brightening, air warming, as though whatever had been there simply left. But Daniel didn't feel relief. He felt watched. He felt followed. And he felt certain the shadow hadn't left with Mary's last breath. The hallway outside the CT suite was unusually quiet once the code team dispersed. No murmured condolences, no half-hearted attempts at small talk. Just a thick, unsettled silence that clung to every staff member who walked past Daniel. People avoided eye contact. Not out of blame, but out of discomfort. Out of fear of what they might say if they actually acknowledged what had happened. Daniel leaned against the wall, his scrubs damp with sweat, his hands trembling despite his attempts to steady them. He kept replaying the moment. Mary's hand lifting, the shadow in the scan, the way the room felt like it was being drained of warmth. His rational brain tried to categorize everything: muscle spasm, artifact, exhaustion, emotional overload, but none of those boxes.
He turned the scout image over in his mind, that dark form, appearing where no mass should be. Not an error, not a miscalculation. It had weight, shape, presence. And the axial slices, the way the shadow moved frame by frame, no imaging artifact behaved like that. His stomach churned. Should he report it? To who? Radiology? IT? Risk management? They would examine the machine, check the logs, see nothing unusual, and look at him like he was unraveling. He could already hear the explanations. Paranoia from fatigue, overactive imagination, simple scanner glitch. But then there was Mary's movement. He replayed it slower in his mind, forcing himself to confront it head on. Her arm didn't jerk, didn't spasm. It rose. Controlled. Purposeful. As if someone, or something, had lifted it for her. And her face. For a brief moment, he thought he saw an expression, a flicker of awareness. Fear? Pain? Relief? He couldn't tell, but something had passed through her in that moment, something he couldn't define. As he tried to gather himself, a knock sounded on the open doorway. It was Dr. Halvorsen, the attending physician who had run the code. Stern, composed, analytical to the core. He rarely visited the imaging break room. "You were the one who took the scans before she crashed?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Can I see them?" Daniel hesitated. A tiny part of him was relieved. Someone else wanted to look, someone who might validate what he saw even if indirectly. He opened the workstation in the corner and pulled up the images. Dr. Halvorsen leaned in, lips pursed as he scrolled. First the scout, then the axial slices. Daniel felt beads of sweat forming on the back of his neck. He braced himself for the reaction. For the moment, the doctor's expression shifted. But it never happened. Halvorsen studied the images carefully, clinically, with no sign of recognition. No tension, no confusion. Just a quiet, as he clicked through. Finally, he straightened. Everything looks standard, nothing unusual from a technical standpoint. Daniel's breath caught. "Sir, the shadow? Did you see? There's no shadow. Artifact-free. Clean study." Daniel's heart dropped. Either the doctor genuinely saw nothing, or something, or someone didn't want the evidence seen. The doctor placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, an unusual gesture for him. "Get some rest, son. Nights like this get to all of us." Then he left. Daniel stared at the blank screen, pulse beginning to race again. The shadow had been there. It had been there. And now it was gone. Erased. But he knew what he saw, and he knew it wasn't finished with him. 2 days later, Mary Collins passed quietly in the ICU. The beeping of monitors slowed to a final, flat line, and then silence. Her family arrived shortly afterward, grief heavy in their eyes, clinging to each other with trembling hands. Daniel stood at the edge of the room, offering quiet words of comfort, a gentle reassurance for the moment she had been conscious. They thanked him, unaware of the shadow, the impossible movement, the dark shape hovering on her CT images. He said nothing. How could he explain what no one would believe? How could he speak the truth without sounding insane? The hospital returned to its usual rhythm almost immediately. Nurses swapped shifts, technicians rotated through the CT suite, the corridors filled once more with the familiar hum of machines and faint echoes of hurried footsteps. Life, relentless and indifferent, carried on. And yet for Daniel, nothing had returned to normal. He found himself replaying that night endlessly. The cold weight in the room, the moving silhouette, the inexplicable twitch of Mary's hand. His rational mind insisted it must have been a hallucination, fatigue, or a glitch in the imaging software. But the memory of the shadow felt as real as the pulse of his own heart, and he could not ignore it. Daniel reflected on what hospitals represent: spaces of life, death, science, and now, mystery. Years of scanning, diagnosing, and observing had taught him the limits of human knowledge. Machines could measure organs, detect tumors, and monitor vitals with near-perfect precision. They could record life's fragile signs, but they could not capture the intangible, the moments that hover on the edge between this world and the next. And in that CT room, for the first time, he glimpsed something beyond science, something unquantifiable, something that belonged neither to life nor to death, but to the unknown space between. Sometimes he wondered if it was Mary's husband who had passed away 3 years ago, appearing for her final moments. Sometimes he feared it was something darker, a shadow unmoored by human understanding, drawn to the threshold of mortality. Either way, it had left its mark, not on the images, not on the records, but on him. He could not unsee what he had witnessed, could not forget the room's heavy, oppressive air, the feeling of being observed, and the certainty that life's end is far more complex than anyone admits. As he stepped outside the hospital that morning, the first pale rays of sunrise stretched across the parking lot, casting long, delicate shadows over the pavement. Daniel paused, breathing deeply, taking in the ordinary world that felt suddenly alien. After years of imaging the human body, after countless patients had passed through his care, he understood for the first time that death is not only biological, it is personal, intimate, and sometimes watched. For a fleeting moment, he thought he glimpsed the shadow one last time, just beyond the edge of the light. And then it was gone. Daniel Carter walked away from the building quietly, a man changed forever. He had seen the limits of science, the fragility of life, and the weight of mysteries that will never be fully explained. And as the sun rose, painting the world in gold, he understood that some truths exist only in the spaces between life and death, and that certain moments, no matter how fleeting, are meant to haunt us forever.